Welcome to the University of Manitoba Alumni and Friends Virtual Learning for Life series. This is the last of our spring session. My name is Tracy Bowen, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations and a proud alumna, and will be the moderator for today's session. Thank you for joining us and making this event part of your day, and in general, for choosing to stay connected with your alma mater in this way. We have been able to offer this program free of charge to all of our 148,000 alumni living in 140 countries around the world, thanks to the very generous sponsorship of one of the University of Manitoba's affinity partners, IA Financial. Many thanks to them. Delivering learning for life opportunities is a very important role for the University of Manitoba, and we're very proud that we're able to showcase so many of our leading professors and researchers in this way. Now, just a few housekeeping details before we begin. You are viewing this webinar on a YouTube link, and you will see both our presenter and the PowerPoint presentation at the same time. Today's session, like every session, is being recorded and will be posted to our website in the next day or two. You were also sent a link to Slido and a password. That the website is www.sli.do. The password is VL30, and you need that if you're wanting to participate and submit questions for our presenter to answer. As the moderator, I will be asking the questions on your behalf, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, who's Dr. Chris Adams, who will be presenting Surviving System Quakes, Canada's Political Economy. Now, just a little bit of a background on Dr. Adams. He's a two-time alumnus of the University of Manitoba from St. Paul's College, and he has a PhD from Carleton University in Ottawa. For over 20 years, he has served in senior positions in the public opinion research industry. He's the author of many journal articles and the book Politics in Manitoba, which has been published by the University of Manitoba. You may have seen him often as a commentator on polling and elections, including on CBC, CTV, Global News, and in the Winnipeg Free Press. And Dr. Adams currently serves as the rector of St. Paul's College, is the chair of the Arthur V. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice, and is an adjunct professor in political studies at the University of Manitoba. And with that, over to you, Dr. Adams.
Thanks very much, Tracy. You know, I'm quite honored to be part of this presentation series, the Virtual Learning for Life series. And I spoke to the Senior Alumni Learning for Life series about a year ago. So some of the people in the audience would have seen me before. I just want to assure everybody that's not the same lecture as before. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call up my slides here, and I think you can see them. What I'm going to be speaking on this time around is what I call Surviving System Quakes, and that is Canada's political economy in the summer of 2020. This series came about, these slides came about originally when I presented to the Center for Conflict and Resilience about a month ago, and they asked me to do a webinar with them. And so I started collecting some of the information that we see in the general press, the Globe and Mail, the Free Press, CBC Online, The Economist. And I started to collect this information. And so I did an op-ed piece for the Winnipeg Free Press as well on this topic. So when Tracy came to me and said, would you like to present to this group? I thought, well, that'd be fine. And June 31st, the day before Canada Day, and I thought I'd present on some of the more recent information that since I started collecting this information, some more information. So what I'm going to be speaking about really, when I talk about surviving quakes, I'm talking about sort of disruptions to our economy and how these are having a rippling effect into the political system. So I'll start off with some worldwide observations with regard to COVID and the pandemic, and how that's going to be having some impact that we've seen recently and going forth in the worldwide economy. Then I'm going to speak about the American economic scene, and it is quite something to be looking south of the border compared to what's happening north of the border. There are some similarities, but also some real differences in what's been happening in the United States economic scene, but also even more glaringly, a difference in what's happening in the United States compared to up here. So I'll talk about that. Then I'm going to shift it over to the Canadian economic scene and just sort of like a very high level look at what's happening with our economy over the past number of months and what the projections are going forward, followed by what the pandemic situation is the impact on our Canadian political scene. And as Tracy mentioned, my background is in polling, 20 years in the polling industry. So I have an orientation to polling data. So you'll forgive me if I emphasize that part in my presentation. And then finally, because I'm in Manitoba, we're all many of us are in Manitoba. I know we're speaking to alumni who are situated all around the world, but I thought it'd be nice to just to bring the presentation down to the local level. How does all this have an impact here in Manitoba? So to start with, things are moving almost on a daily basis, or at the very least a weekly basis in the globe. And this slide I've derived from the Worldometers, which is a website which provides tracking on all the countries in the world on COVID, as well as particular regions. Like if you went to the United States, you'd be able to look up particular states. So I have a brother who's an actuary who works in Hong Kong. He's got a daughter who's going to Yale University in the United States, and he wants to come to Canada, and he travels to the United Kingdom regularly for business. So he is tracking when he's planning his travels, he's going to this website to see what's happening in particular regions of the world. I think what's really striking about this slide is that half of this entire pie belongs to about 4 countries, that is India, Russia, Brazil, and the United States. And 1/4 of this pie is the United States. It's very different than 2 months ago, where we saw Italy and Spain and the United Kingdom as being or of course, China and Korea. But we're now seeing the North America, South America as being very strong on this pie, as well as Russia and India. You know, in the United States, the changing of what's going on, we all been hearing about in Florida. I think there are 9,000 cases announced in last Friday. California announced 10,000 cases just recently in a single day. So the United States is very quickly becoming the real epicenter for this. But of course, things are changing. We expect that, not in a happy way, things are changing, that we're starting to see Africa very badly affected. So they're going to be taking bigger parts of this pie. And I was just on the phone to some colleagues for a project we're working on in Kathmandu, Nepal, and they're in lockdown right now. So the world scene is changing quite a bit. Now, in terms of the worldwide economy, the International Monetary Fund, and I've been trying to pull together very recent reports from the past few days for this presentation. So June 24th, the IMF released some projections for the current year as well as the coming year, and this was released in the Bloomberg News June 25th. So global fiscal supports, that is, money is coming from the governments to support problems arising from the pandemic. Supports are in the range of $11 trillion. We know the American Congress has passed more than $3 trillion in emergency funding in the United States, but worldwide global fiscal supports at $11 trillion. Global trade volumes are down by 11%, 11.9% in 2020. And that's a projection for the whole year, not just up to date right now. Global gross domestic product is shrinking by 5%. That's the projection for this year. 6% in the USA, 10% in Europe, 4.5% in India, 9% in Brazil, 10% in Mexico. So there's a different impact around the world, but the gross domestic product is showing that our economies are shrinking right now. The good news is 2021, the projection is back to the IMF is that the global economy is going to be expanding in 2021. So taking back those losses that we had over the past year, 4.5% in USA, 6% in Europe. So we see worldwide quakes and how that's affecting the economy, but there's hope that things will be bouncing back. In the United States, some statements by Jerome Powell, the chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve, just about 4 weeks ago, as well as other statements in the American media, some recent figures. April and May, 36 million people became unemployed just in 2 months alone. All job gains since the beginning of the Obama administration and up to now were wiped out in those 2 months. Congress, though, in response, as I mentioned earlier, over $3 trillion in American dollars released for emergency spending. This was quite unusual for us political scientists to see both the Republicans and the Democrats working together to pass this type of emergency spending. I'm not so sure we'll see this relationship continuing on, especially with the American election coming into a higher gear. But regardless, in April and May, there was some bipartisan behavior for emergency spending. And then retail sales increased in May compared to April. So while things were looking quite dire at the end of April, we did see a bounce back in retail sales. But as we're hearing in the United States, in certain parts, there's a need to go back into lockdown in many of the states. So with the economy taking a big hit worldwide and in the United States, there's also the concerns about defunding police, the demonstrations by people who are protesting about the activities by the police and other authorities with visible minorities, in particular African Americans. So there is political fallout both with the pandemic as well as with the concerns about brutalizing of American citizens who are Black citizens. So the political fallout, this picture many of you have seen, or videos of this of President Trump with the Bible, going to the church nearby and standing strongly from his perspective against the demonstrations. So what's happening in the polls with recent events? This poll came out, it was released by the New York Times just late last week. It's a national poll of 1,300 registered voters, not just Americans, but those who are registered to vote. It was done in later part of June. And you can see Joe Biden is leading for the Democrats by 50% over Trump by 36%. That's a very significant separation of those two parties. There have been other polls that have been put out by CNN which support this type of lead by Joe Biden, and we've seen Trump lashing back at the pollsters and the media for these types of results. The excerpt from the New York Times article, just to cite a few of the things they said, nearly 3/5, so close to 75% of voters disapprove of Trump's handling of the pandemic. That includes significantly majorities of white voters and men. And those are the people that Trump sees as his core support in the last presidential election that we'd expect. Those would be the people he'd be hoping as his solid backers. But three-fifths of those people are of general population disapproving, but also a majority of some who would be core voters for President Trump. Also, self-described moderate voters disapproved of President Trump on the pandemic by a margin of more than 2-1. So Trump, not surprisingly, Canadians have been quite shocked about the behavior of Trump watching our television news, but we aren't surprised that moderate voters are unhappy with their president's handling. But a 21-point margin, voters said the federal government should be doing more to contain the pandemic than to helping the economy. That is, the coronavirus seems to be more of a priority for voters than reopening the economy. And it's been more the right of center governors and the president who've been looking to open the economy to, as we know, the detriment of many Americans. 61% of voters said they disapproved of Trump's handling of race versus 33% who said they approved. So we're seeing that the voters are unhappy both in the dealing of the pandemic, but also in the dealing of race issues going on right now in the United States. And then by a similar margin, voters said they disapproved of his specific response to the protests after the death of Mr. Floyd. So this is from the New York Times. As you can imagine, Donald Trump does not like the New York Times, but regardless, they are a credible source for news. So this slide, I thought you'd be interested in this. This is The Economist. Just recently, last week, they put out this slide. The blue dots represent Democratic support in each state. The red dots represent Republican support. As you know, most states, when they cast their vote for the president, most states send all of their electoral votes to the Electoral College. So it's not like 20% of California versus 80%. All of the electoral votes go to the presidential candidate, with a few exceptions. So you can see on the eastern sideboard and the western sideboard, many electoral votes. The larger the dot, the more electoral votes. You can see the Democrats are doing very well, and more in the central states and the southern states that Donald Trump is receiving support, such as Alabama, Tennessee, Oklahoma, so on and so forth. Now, The smaller dots, though, for Trump is that he's not getting as many electoral votes. Like North and South Dakota only have 2 electoral votes. So you'll see on the bar at the bottom of that slide, this is where you can start seeing what does this signify for winning a majority, winning the majority of electoral votes in the Electoral College. So that bar at the bottom shows the darker the blue, that's the more support for Biden. The lighter the blue, the more it's a closer margin of support. You start seeing into gray, Wisconsin and Florida. Those are just very slightly in favor of the Democrats. And then going to the right is still on, you can't call Arizona, North Carolina, Ohio, or Georgia anyway yet. But those are, as you start going to the right, that starts getting more strongly in support of Donald Trump. So I would say that, you know, if you're wanting Trump to be defeated, as many Canadians do, and it's quite typical over the past 40 years that Canadians tend to, in polls, show stronger support for Democratic presidential candidates than Republican candidates when they're asked. But it does show that if an election were held today, Joe Biden would probably win the election, just looking at that bottom bar. But things can move quite easily. And we do know in the last election that people doing projections on where's the American electorate going, the projections, not the polls so much. There are some polls that were inaccurate for some of the key swing states, but the projections were really where we got to trouble by seeing people predicting Hillary Clinton with 70, 80, 90% chance of winning the election. And in the end, Trump won in that election. So those who are cheering for Joe Biden right now north of the border can take some comfort for the polls, but at the same time, things could change. But right now, it looks very bad for Donald Trump. So moving along more to north of the border and into the United States and system quakes, what's happening with the pandemic in Canada to our economy, and what does this signify for the politics in Canada? So this, again, is very recent information that I've acquired from the Conference Board of Canada. The Conference Board of Canada just released this report June 21st, so it's just a week old, and they gave some projections for what's happening in the economy. And if you don't use the Conference Board, if you're interested, you can go to their site and you can register for free. They charge you for some of the reports, but you can also access some of the highlights of the report. So I just want to show you this summer 2020 report. They did some of the highlights from June 21st. So like in the United States, where we saw many, many million people, Canada usually has 1/10 of the population of the United States. So where they would have 30 million people becoming unemployed, in Canada, we had 3 million who lost their jobs due to the pandemic in April and May. So our citizens have been hit. Also nearly 300,000, this is a good news aspect, is there's been some bounce back. 300,000 jobs were regained in May. Household consumption dipped in 2020. So that's January, February, and March, dipped by 11%. I would say much of that dipping occurred, of course, in the later part of March, but the dip was to 11% in the first quarter of this calendar year. But in the second quarter, that is up to the end of June, it's seen as dropping by 57%. So the real hammering to the Canadian economy has been in the last 3 months. In terms of projecting where are we going into the future, the Conference Board of Canada says spending won't return to past levels till 2021 in the third quarter. So that's pretty well a year and a half from now that we'll see people spending on cars and on consumable items, electronics, big appliances, and things like that. So we will be in for a tough scenario for the next number of months in terms of getting back to what we call normal. The other thing is in private sector investment, similar to household consumption dipping, also private sector investment has dipped by 11% in 2021, and that's for the full year. That is January till the end of December. The projection by the Conference Board of Canada is that we'll have lost 11% in terms of investment levels here in Canada, and that's renovating a restaurant, putting in new equipment, building a new outlet, things like that. But the economy for 2020, starting in January and going to the end of December, is forecasted to have contracted to shrink by 8%, which is the worst annual contraction on record. I'm not sure how far that goes back, but I think that would also go back to the early 30s. The economy is forecast, though, to rebound, according to the Conference Board of Canada, and it's forecasted to rebound by 6.7% in 2021, and then 4.8% in 2022. So while things might look bleak right now in terms of our economy, I would say that there are good signs. Of course, you know, if the pandemic worsened and we had to go back into 100% lockdown for 12 straight months, things would be different. But the forecast right now from the information people have been able to obtain is that after the end of this year, we'll start seeing a rebound for our economies. So what is the political fallout? And we see there Justin Trudeau with his well-groomed beard and his flowing locks that we've all appreciated seeing. As somebody said to me earlier today, don't they have barbers in Ontario? But I guess that this is fairly symbolic that he's allowed this to continue. But anyway, what is the fallout, or what is the impact? As we saw in the United States, the pandemic has had an impact on the political fortunes, probably the political fortunes of Donald Trump. In Canada, and this is a poll done by Abacus Research, Abacus Data, and some of you might be familiar with Bruce Anderson. We see him. We used to see him Thursday nights on CBC, The National. He'd be on the Thursday panel with Andrew Coyne and Chantal Hébert. But I'm not sure if he's still on that. But his company does polling as well, general polling for commercial clients as well as public affairs clients. And he's been doing a lot of survey work for Universities Canada, which represents the university presidents and colleges, including myself, in Canada. So he's been presenting to us on some of the data about students coming back. Do they feel safe coming back? But because I'm focusing here on the political economy, I'm focusing here on what's happening in Ottawa. So the government approval, you look at this, the election 2019, that's that bar right to the right of the Peace Tower you can see on that slide. You can see the disapproval ratings, that is the percent saying they disapprove of how the government is doing its job. That is a general statement that's tracked every quarter, by Abacus every month. So do you approve or disapprove of the job the federal government is doing? That's the question. You can see at the election of 2019 that the disapproval was slightly higher than the approval. So that doesn't necessarily mean a defeat, because those who disapprove of the government might vote for the NDP or the Greens or the Conservatives, or somebody actually vote for the Liberals, even though they disapprove of how they're doing. But that red bar going to the right, 44% disapproval to 43 to 42%, and then it drops in March, that should say March 20, and then drops, it stays low at May 2020. So we can see a reversal of fortune for the federal government in terms of approval ratings, starting around the time just prior to the March hit of the pandemic, and at 58% approval ratings, which, you know, I have not seen those numbers as a past pollster. I can't remember seeing numbers like that for a long, long time. So we can see the benefit that the federal government is reaping some support from the general electorate on its work being done. Now, this chart shows the parties themselves. So if an election were held today, which party would you vote for? And of those who know of those who are leaning towards or have a party they would decide to vote for, you can see that from the election, which the Liberals were at 33% compared to 32%, statistical tie, just 1 point difference in this poll. You can see as they move across, as each poll is done, you can see as of March 2020, it was a statistical tie for the Conservatives. In fact, some polls had the Conservatives leading the Liberals at the beginning of March in the polls. And then as the pandemic unfolded, you can see the Liberals gaining support at 39% compared to 29% of the Conservative Party, and the NDP being up a little bit, up to 19%. So there are a couple of things going on here. One is the Liberals, being present. The Prime Minister giving daily press conferences on measures, the CERB, that is the emergency release of funds to people who aren't working right now, who need emergency funds, student supports, etc. I would say that there will be a day of reckoning for the debt that will have to be paid back, the growing deficit. But for now, I would say Canadians are happy that their prime minister and their government are making these regular, almost daily announcements to things. I would say there's another factor going on here. The Conservative Party right now has Andrew Scheer as its leader. There's been dissatisfaction with Andrew Scheer, who now has announced he's stepping down. So there are people who aren't rallying around the Conservative Party. The other thing is that we don't know who will be the next leader, and the leader race for the Conservative Party, which is with four candidates, really two front runners, McKay and Aaron O'Toole. Those would be really the front two runners. Hasn't really garnered a lot of excitement in the Canadian electorate. People aren't watching the debates. We'll have to see in August how they do in terms of the leadership convention. But I would say right now things are not looking very good for the Liberals. Another a factor to keep in mind is that election in November, or I should say October. The election, the federal election, produced not a minority government; it produced a majority government. So I would say the Liberals would be very happy to go to the electorate, any day now, as long as they aren't accused of bringing down the government. Right now, the Liberals are supported by the NDP on any votes of confidence. The Liberals have had to do some negotiating with the NDP to maintain that support. But I would say that the Liberals would not be unhappy to see themselves going to an election in the fall or in the next half year. At the same time, I think they would not want to be accused of triggering an election during a pandemic, during this situation. Things could change quite a bit. The Conservatives, once they have a new leader who might be more capable of handling the party in Parliament. Andrew Scheer has not done a great job in the past couple of months. We might see these numbers change quite significantly. As you know, voters do not have an identification with political parties like they used to 30 years ago. And so voters are more volatile than they were decades ago. So things could change quite a bit. Just as Justin Trudeau's support has strengthened quite a bit with the pandemic, things could change again for the Conservatives. I thought this slide by Abacus was quite interesting. And what they did is they took the impression of Justin Trudeau, whether it's positive or negative, but for all their polls, they pulled out those who identified themselves as visible minorities, that is African Canadians or East Indian Canadians or Indigenous people, so on and so forth. So how they do that is with a poll, you take the full numbers and then you take a segment of those when you have a particular question and you look at how their numbers are showing. I did reach out to David Coletto, who's one of the heads of Abacus Research, and I asked what the sample size is. I didn't get a response. I'm sorry about that, but I would imagine probably 20 to 25% in each poll has visible minorities in it. So when you look at these subsamples and how over time their view of Justin Trudeau has been, is you can see the positive numbers have really increased in March, and up to 56% in mid-May and 55% at the end of May, and then still in the 50s in June. And I would say in part that's the government and reaping the rewards of their visibility and responding to the pandemic. But at the same time, I would say that Justin Trudeau has been very visible on issues regarding systemic racism. And you can see that his recent announcement with the first ministers, there were some premiers who did not go along with the use of systemic as the word to include with racism. The word now is that Legault, Premier Legault in Quebec had problems including that word. And also, according to the Winnipeg Free Press today, that people are saying Brian Pallister was also resisting the use of that term. In contrast, Jason Kenney apparently went along with using that term. So, but regardless, we've seen Justin Trudeau stepping in a very visible way forward to be part of rallies regarding racism in Canada. At this point, I do want to just confirm with people who are watching this slideshow that I'm not partisan. I don't belong to any party. I worked in the polling industry for many years. I'm a political scientist and I do media commentary, and I'm very careful not to be partisan. So my role here when I'm showing slides like this is to show what are the numbers saying? What are the numbers saying about what the electorate's mood is right now? And with a slide like this, you can say that the mood among those who are visible, part of visible minorities in Canada, is very positive for Justin Trudeau. So now I want to switch over a little bit to some of the aggregated polls and the seat projections that are being shown these days regarding the outcome of these polls. So this one is produced by Eric Grenier, and if you don't know who Eric Grenier is, he used to do a very popular website called 308.com, and that was back when there were only 308 seats in the House of Commons. And he would pull together these polls and then rebroadcast them. Pollsters themselves don't like aggregators very much, and the reason why some of the big polling companies aren't crazy about Eric Grenier is the polling companies spend the money, they put out the polls, and then someone like Grenier aggregates them and then re-releases them. So Grenier more, I think he does a great service. I think the service he does for us to get an overview of what all the polls are saying at any given time. He's a very competent analyst, and he now works for the CBC. And you can see his website there at the bottom of the screen. I would say Eric Grenier is quite neutral, and he anyway, his analysis is quite good. And he also does analysis on spending for candidates and things like that. So what this slide is showing you is that polls coming out in each month, what do they look like when they're all pulled together? So what are the patterns that we see? So you can see the pattern that I showed a while ago about Abacus Research and what they were showing for how the Liberals were doing compared to the Conservatives. It's not just Abacus showing that, is a trend that a number of polling companies, including Ipsos, Leger, Nick Nanos's company, so on and so forth. So we can see that since March, when in fact many of the polls had the Liberals doing more poorly than the Conservatives, since mid-March or early March, the Liberals have achieved quite a gain over the opposition. Here's something I want to show you as well. What Eric Grenier does is he takes the polls. He also looks at the patterns relating to each region historically, how they've gone for each party, and looks at some of the shifts in the polls for certain regions. So so for this slide, we can see the seat projections. That is, would the Liberals win a majority or a minority? You can see that the bulk of the projection puts them into the majority side. That is Grenier says there's a 78%, according to his seat projection model, 78% that if an election were held today, that it would be a majority government, that is a majority of seats in the Parliament, in the House of Commons. There is a small chance, 21%, that if an election were held today, that it would be a minority rather than a majority. Regardless, if an election were held today, it's almost 99% sure that this would be a victory for the Liberals, either a minority or a majority. Of course, these projections would change as polling numbers change, but as of late June, these were the seat projections, June 21st, the seat projections coming out of Eric Grenier. I tend to look more closely at the polling numbers than projections, and the reason is that there's a bit of mathematical wizardry that goes into these projections, and based on historical data in certain regions. If something happens that's quite out of the ordinary, then the projections aren't as valid. And an example is the projections during the last American election. The projections all had Hillary Clinton going for a very strong predictability for winning that election. And what it was a few key states with polls that were incorrect, and that was enough to throw the projections off. So I do counsel people when I'm talking about polling and projections that you can't go to the bank on these, but they still give you a sense of where things are going. So I'm now going to bring this presentation down to the Manitoba scene. We've gone from the global down to the national, and now I want to take it down to the Manitoba scene. Of course, there'll be people who are in the audience who are in other parts of the globe watching this, but you still might be interested in seeing this, whether you're an international student or a local student when you were studying here at the University of Manitoba. So here I want to show you Angus Reid. I worked with Angus Reid some years ago, and his company turned into Ipsos Reid in Canada. But Angus since then opened up his own company called Angus Reid Institute. It relies on online surveys, and it's very good. His data is very good, and I do recommend his website if you're looking for data regarding attitudes of Canadians to religion, to their premiers, to the economy, so on and so forth. So Angus Reid put out this, it was in late May, so it's not as new as some of the other numbers I've been showing you, but late May it showed the percentage of Canadians saying that their provincial government had done a good job, and that's in quote, in handling COVID-19, that is handling the pandemic crisis in their province. So as you can see, New Brunswick tops the list with 91%. And I think people in the media had that sense that the Premier was doing fairly well. Halfway down, you can see Doug Ford in Ontario. 81% see that the government in Ontario had been handling it fairly well. I would say things that have chipped away at the Ontario situation have been some slowness in testing. Also, the crisis in the seniors' homes and hospitals have been poor. So I think that pulled down some of the Ontario numbers. But you can see that Manitoba is at the bottom of the list, that only 70% of Manitobans thought that their provincial government had been doing a good job. Now, I would say that the pandemic situation has not just been one thing. I think that there are a couple of things you can break apart in that. Just like you, I think, how is the government doing in terms of handling the health crisis, that is testing and hospitalizations and things like that, and how is the government handling the economic crisis? So I would say that this graph in ways sort of clouds the fact that there are a couple of issues when you look at the pandemic. So looking at the next chart, this just was released about 2 weeks ago by Probe Research, another company I worked with for a few years, and actually for 8 years. But Probe Research put out this poll just about a week ago. It came out in the Winnipeg Free Press. And here they split the issue into two areas. That is, overall, how would you rate the performance of the Pallister government when it comes to protecting the health of Manitobans during the COVID-19 pandemic? So this top bar that you're seeing is as it relates to how well has the government handled the situation. And 77% said they approve how it handled. That is 37 very strongly approved, 40% somewhat strongly approved. So somewhat approved. So you can see generally that the majority of Manitobans think that the government did a good job in handling, at least up until late May, the pandemic crisis in healthcare. And 23%, that yellow and red bar, only 23% or less than a quarter think that Manitoba did a poor job of handling the pandemic, which those are good numbers, and especially if you think of the broader context of the complaints about the Pallister government a year ago was the restructuring of the hospital system and the WHR and so on and so forth. It shows that the electorate has sort of put that behind them a little bit as with regard to the pandemic. So, but if we split the pandemic issue apart into the economic impact, you can see when they're asked overall, how would you rate the performance of the Pallister government when it comes to dealing with the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? You can see the numbers become much weaker. That is, 61% of Manitobans think that they somewhat or strongly approve of the provincial government's handling of the economic impact, and that 39% disapprove of how the government. So those numbers aren't as rosy. I would, there's an article today by Karen Levasseur and Lorna Turnbull. Karen Levasseur is a political scientist at a colleague of mine here at the University of Manitoba, and Lorna Turnbull was past a dean of law here at the University of Manitoba. They have a very good op-ed piece in the Free Press today, and they talk about, you know, the economic programs that the provincial government has put forth, and it's quite a critique, and I think for those interested in this topic, you might find this of some interest. So here I'm going to go back to some of the Angus Reid Institute numbers, and in addition to looking at how They looked at how governments have done across the country. They also asked, how do you rate Premier Brian Pallister? Do you approve or disapprove of your premier? And so you can see that they've been tracking this. This chart goes back to 2016. And you can see that he's ranged between 34% and 50% in support in terms of approval. When you go up to September 2019, that's the latter part of this chart, Brian Pallister's at 48%, which was really where he was at when he won the last provincial election. You can see it dip down, and then it's at 47%. So a person looking at this might say, okay, well, he hasn't done that bad. He's back where pretty close to where he was at the last provincial election. He's probably doing okay. He had a dip in February, but it's not too bad. So, but when we compare it to some of the other provinces, and here I'm going to look at Doug Ford, who was quite unpopular at periods of time after his election, you can see that he's had a real uptake in support approval ratings among the Ontario electorate. And you can see, looking back at September 2019, he was at 37. Around Christmas, he was at 35%, 31% in February. But since then, he's jumped up to 69%. So he's more than doubled his approval rating since the pandemic hit. So I would say that when you compare Premier Pallister to some of the other premiers, that he hasn't reaped the benefits of the pandemic, if you can talk about reaping the benefits of a pandemic. But regardless, he hasn't gotten the kudos that others such as Doug Ford have received. And as you saw in an earlier slide of Justin Trudeau. So now, one thing in Manitoba that kind of clouds what's going on is when you look at Manitoba numbers, are you looking at particular regions of the province or the overall province? So this is the overall province, and you can see the Conservatives in a poll just released recently by Probe Research for the Winnipeg Free Press in June, that the progressive Conservatives have dropped from 47% down to 38%. So they've dropped down close to 10 points up until now from their election. And the NDP have moved up to 36%. So pretty well the two parties provincially are in a statistical tie right now. You might say, okay, well, he's a year in, Pallister is 1 year into his term of office in his second term. You know, you make the tough decisions early on, 3 years until an election. Well, that's true. So I would say it's too early for progressive Conservatives to start panicking, especially they have a new clerk of the Executive Council, David McLaughlin, who was the campaign manager of the last two provincial elections. They've got that new clerk, that is the top civil servant in Manitoba, has very smart political abilities, and I would say that they'll be used quite a bit at this time. So, but when you look at the Winnipeg picture, this is where things look very difficult for the progressive Conservatives. Of the 57 seats in the Manitoba legislature, more than half of them, about 30, 31, more than half of them are in the Winnipeg region, either in Winnipeg or just in the suburbs. So to win a provincial election, you really have to do very well in Winnipeg. And Pallister was able to do that the last two elections. He took a lot of the support that Gary Doer and Selinger were able to garner in their heydays from Winnipeg voters, including middle-class voters. But these numbers look very poor for the progressive Conservatives. It shows that the Tories are down from 38% down to 25%. Only 1/4 of Winnipeggers say they would support the progressive Conservatives right now, and a whopping 44% of Winnipeggers say they would support the NDP and Wab Kinew if an election were held today. So I would say that the story here is that when we go back a bit, that the Conservatives are strong outside of the city. They're getting their support from towns and small cities outside of Winnipeg. But when we look at Winnipeg, that there's a real problem. So there's going to be work to be done by the progressive Conservatives to win back voters but they have 3 years, which is a long time to go. So I would say it's too early for them to be really worried, but still they have to be showing some concern. So I'm just going to wrap up here with just a few remarks, and I've appreciated people holding on to be watching these slides filled with a whole lot of numbers. The first thing is the U.S. and Canadian economies are under great strain right now. So great strain, unemployment, contracting economies, declining investments, and so on and so forth. But there is hope. The cause of stress may be temporary. We might have, or we might not have, but we might have a vaccine sometime in the next 5-6 months. People are learning about social distancing. We see in our province here that we only have 1 or 2 new cases every day or so. So I would say that the stress may be temporary for some people, and there might be relief down the line. With regard to the political fallout of the pandemic, while the economies have suffered both north of the border and south of the border, the political fallout of the pandemic has been very different in the United States compared to Canada. In the USA, Trump is in trouble. I would say he is in trouble. He might be able to turn things around. It could be that the pollsters haven't actually captured all of the support for Trump, but I would say he is in trouble right now. And I'd say in Canada, the Liberals and most premiers are reaping a great amount of rewards in the polling data, and people are very supportive of their government, including the federal government. But at the same time, there might be a financial reckoning. I think Canadians are very supportive of the large programs that have been rolled out by the Liberal government, supports for people with disabilities, support for students. I have to say, not for international students. We have many international students here in St. Paul's College and the University of Manitoba who are having troubles because they don't have access to many of these student support programs. But nevertheless, there are many programs coming out for the Canadian citizens, but there might be a financial reckoning. There will be Bill Marneau on July 6th, or it might be July 8th. July 8th, the Minister of Finance for Canada will be giving a financial statement. We have not seen a federal budget for this year. Usually budgets are rolled out in March and April. We did not get a federal budget in March. It was during the pandemic shutdown. So we still haven't seen the full numbers for even the pre-pandemic forecast for the government. We did see the Manitoba budget released just shortly beforehand. And of course, things have changed since then. But there will be a financial reckoning. And by that, I mean that we will have very, very large increases to the Canadian debt, and that means to the debt, but also to our annual deficits. So I would watch for the statement by Bill Marneau in the next week and a half. What's working well for us right now is interest rates are low. This is not the same situation when Paul Martin was Minister of Finance during the 1990s under Jean Chrétien when he was the Prime Minister. Paul Martin brought in severe cutbacks to the federal government. The ratio of debt to a gross domestic product was very high, but we're fortunate right now that we're taking on all of we're increasing our deficits and more debt during a period in which interest rates are low. But we do have to be concerned about the downgrading of our ratings, and so I know we've just had one announcement for a downgrading of a rating for Canada. We haven't seen the major ratings firms announcing major downgrading, but we will have to watch for that. What's working for us is right now interest rates are very, very low, and so we can handle these increasing amounts of debt over the next short while. But Manitoba's PC government, as I talked about, is taking some hits. The financial picture is yet to be clear. We want to see in the next month what is the financial picture. There are differences between what the Royal Bank of Canada was announcing for our deficit size and what the government was announcing. So we still have to see what's going to be happening, but we do know that we are seeing increased deficits in Manitoba. But as I said before, the province is in its first year of a 4-year term for the government. I have to say that the Premier called an election a year earlier than for the set election dates according to law. Kind of a wiggle room in the wording of that language. He was allowed to call it a year early. And I must say that it's very fortunate for the Premier that they did go ahead last year instead of this year. So those are my comments. I want to thank everybody for being part of the virtual presentation. I do want to say that I'm very appreciative of what the University of Manitoba is doing these days to support the community. I'm appreciative of donors to our emergency bursaries that have been put forward to students. And I want to say I'm appreciative to the Alumni Association. I'm a member of the Alumni as well, and for their supports and communications with people. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was a very interesting presentation. I mean, I've got 2 degrees in political studies, so I love this stuff too. It's so interesting to me, particularly polling as well. So we have a few questions that have come through. I encourage everyone to ask your questions. So the first question is, it says, all of the polling takes in visible minorities. What I don't see is how women see things to be seen and heard.
Sure. And I'll just mention that Tracy and I used to work in the marketing research industry, and we used to compete with each other on proposals. So we've kind of gone full circle here. We're now back at the university, both of us, as political scientists as well. But I appreciate the question, and the good news is a question like that is easy to answer. That is when you see polls released, if you click on the links of a polling company, or often, like if you look at Global TV, for instance, Global News, CJOB, they have an association with Ipsos, which is one of the best companies in Canada. And they usually have a link on their website to these polls that you can go to the actual report by the polling firm. And those polling firms usually do break things out into some data tables or some summary tables where you can see women and men and how they compare with each other for support for political parties. So it's not difficult to find those numbers. I don't have those numbers right on hand for the United States. They are fairly easy if you go to one of these polling websites and look at one of the major pollsters to see how they differentiate. But I would say for Manitoba that the tradition, over the past number of decades, I've been looking at Canadian political patterns here, is that women are, within the province of Manitoba, for political parties, women tend to be more supportive of the NDP compared to men. And at the federal level, the women in Manitoba tend to be more, among Liberal supporters, you have a stronger tendency among women to support them than men. So the gender difference is that men tend to like the Conservative Party more than women do, and women at the provincial level like the NDP more than men do, and at the federal level they like the Liberal Party more than men do. Doesn't mean a majority, but they have a stronger affinity to the Liberals. There was a recent poll put out just a week ago on the federal parties in Manitoba, and right now Liberals are spanking everybody else in the province. In Winnipeg, if a federal election were held today, all of Winnipeg would turn red, just like it did in 2000 and trying to remember my numbers, 2015 federal election, with the exception of maybe of Transcona and northern Manitoba. So, but there is a difference between women and men in the polling data, and it's not difficult to find.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Okay, question 3 quakes. Number 1, severe second COVID-19 wave in Canada. Number 2, prolonged collapse of U.S. economy. Number 3, no vaccine widely available until 2022. Impact on poll results.
Yeah, I'm unlike my colleague Delantha Fernando, who's the dean of my college, who's a scientist and can speak to the things on vaccines and things like that. As a political scientist, I, like people in the audience, I'm a layperson following the news on and what do experts say when they're interviewed on CTV or CBC and what have you. So, along with many people watching this presentation, I would say that we're all sort of preparing for what's going to happen in the coming year. As a layperson, I do know that we do practice social distancing better now than we did in late March. We have a sense of what are dangerous behaviors. We know that when we expand our bubble, that we're taking on risk. So I would say that if a second wave occurs, myself as a layperson, I would expect fellow citizens to be behaving in a certain way, to wear masks, to be more able to access testing. So I would say that we would be a little bit more prepared going into a second wave in Canada than we were when we were in Toronto or Ottawa or Montreal or Winnipeg back in late March. I would say that the collapsed economy, I would say that we'll have to see, and we're just going by outlooks of these experts. But I have to say that the last U.S. election, I bet against Donald Trump. I gave somebody 2-to-1 odds, and it was a Jesuit priest I bet with, and I learned the lesson. One is not to be so sure of myself, but secondly, not to bet with Jesuit priests. So, so with that, I would say that a prolonged collapsed economy, we might see some real political fallout that we don't see right now, and we do hope for a vaccine. We also hope for some way by which COVID could be treated, even if you aren't vaccinated, but how could you be treated, or a prophylactic, that is something that would stop you from being affected. But I'm as well educated as most of the people on this call. So it's the best guess right now.
Okay, thank you. Next question is the hit the current PC government is taking just a blip, or will we see it continue? I presume the PC government, the Progressive Conservative government. I would say, there are a lot of things that could happen. Speaking as a political scientist, I do know that Brian Pallister has made sort of like a very subtle signs that he's not going to be there at the next election. He's a man who works very hard, but at the same time, he's a man who respects the idea of taking a break when you need it, or vacationing with your family and so on. I'm not going to go too much into that. I think many people on the call know what I'm talking about. But at the same time, I'm not sure that he will be there at the next election. So what might happen would be probably an urban candidate who would be from the PC caucus. There are a few who are fairly high profile. Rochelle Squires might be one. So anyway, just to name one or two, but I would see that a leadership race would happen prior to the next election, and there'd be a bit of a buzz in the province and all that. And you don't know, like the NDP, how is Wab Kinew doing? Will his caucus sort of hold together? They were a very split caucus a few years ago. Will they show solidarity going into the next election, and so on and so forth? So, and then of course, what about Dougald Lamont and the Liberals? They're still like just below 20%, which isn't a great number for the Liberals, but I think they have a capacity to steal votes from the Progressive Conservatives as well as the NDP in Winnipeg. So this is probably a blip that you're seeing. If things work out, we're past the pandemic, hopefully in a year from now, and we're employment's back up and people are less grouchy about the premier, then I could see this being a blip right now, and fortunes turned around for the Conservatives. Okay, thanks. The next question is, has any pollster conducted a recent poll about the democracy deficit with respect to the House of Commons not meeting or not debating major federal decisions?
Yeah, I would say that many Canadians aren't as attentive as some of the people watching this lecture today are. We do know that, generally speaking, that House of Commons is acting like a committee as a whole, that they're focusing on the pandemic, the issues raised by Andrew Scheer and others in the Conservative Party, which are valid concerns. There are many other issues in the House of Commons. We aren't seeing a question period properly. We aren't seeing, actually, in the provincial legislature, we aren't seeing as much sitting as we normally should. So I would say that people who are very attentive to these things are interested in these topics. And I would say the general person, I think about people in my neighborhood. They know generally that Trudeau is at the podium. They know generally that he's making announcements. They aren't following what's going on in the House of Commons, the committee as a whole, and so on and so forth. So I would say that the trouble of doing a poll on that topic, you have to kind of measure things indirectly, like, is the government doing a good job or not a good job? How is it doing in terms of handling the economy? How is it doing in terms of handling the health crisis? Those are the sort of things that people do have an opinion. If you start asking questions really focused on the democratic deficit in the House of Commons or other areas, then you start getting what Philip Converse would call non-opinions. That is, people have opinions about things they know nothing about. And so you don't have precise polls on that thing, though it would be interesting to have sort of roundabout things. But I think the best way to measure it is, do you approve or disapprove of the government? Do you disapprove or approve of Justin Trudeau, so on and so forth?
Speaking of polling, have you seen more, less, or about the same number of polls during this time that people are at home?
You know, I'm a member of the World Association of Public Opinion Research, and acronym is WAPOR, W-A-P-O-R, and they were created at the same time that the American Association of Public Opinion Research was created back in the 1940s. And there are, so I follow some of these things going back into history. I would say that we see a lot of polls when there are elections. Okay, so wasn't 30 years ago we'd see a poll every couple of weeks coming out, and you'd see more polls as we got towards an election date. And during elections, when there's a real uncertainty, for instance, there were like a huge, let's say probably about 20 polls done in Manitoba for the first Brian Pallister election, because people are wondering, is the NDP going to be turfed out or not? So I'm giving a long-winded answer. I apologize for this. But so what we're seeing right now is a lot of polling, because a lot of people are interested in the pandemic issue. And I'm seeing a lot of polling released internationally. The World Opinion Research Organization is releasing polls in Costa Rica and Brazil and Spain and in Taiwan, Nigeria. I'm seeing these almost on a daily basis from different places. So there are a lot of polls going on, and I'm seeing a lot of polls in Canada being covered. But there's something else going on as well, is polling has moved from when Tracy Bowman was in the industry, and when I was competing with her, the way of doing polling was really done by telephone. Now, almost all polls are either done through IVR, that is robocalling, IVR, interactive voice response, where you respond with a button on your phone, or online polling. And those polls are getting to be very, very reliable and effective. So the reason why I mention this is that it's cheaper for companies to do polling much more frequently than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And so we are seeing a lot of polls right now being released, in part because it's cheaper to do polls, but also because people are interested in seeing the polling numbers on the pandemic.
So I know you said that you learned a few lessons when you betted Jesuit priests on the last election in the U.S. Do you hazard a guess what's going to happen in this November?
Well, you know, in my defense, I went to I go to every state that I can find and see what are the polling numbers, and then each state has a certain number of electoral votes, and I say, okay, then I start tallying them, right? When I went through the polls of all the states in the last American election, most of those states, the polls were right. They predicted Trump or Hillary, and so where things really went wonky was Florida. I think Wisconsin was another one. Maybe I'm trying to think, but anyway, some people I'm sure are shouting at the screen right now saying, "What about?" Anyway, when a state is called incorrectly, let's say you're calling. I'm just going to say one. Let's say you're calling North Dakota incorrectly. That's 2 electoral votes, and you call it that incorrectly. That means it drops 2 votes for that candidate, and it goes up 2 electoral votes for the other candidate. So you're in error by 4 electoral college votes, not just by 2, calling it the wrong way. So with that being said, I would say that I would still put my money on Joe Biden. I would say the numbers are probably showing Democrats are winning the swing voters. I would say Trump has done certain things that have really turned off a lot of voters over the past while. And I think a lot of people might have voted for Trump thinking, okay, well, he's all bluster. He's going to close the borders. He's going to do these things, but he's all bluster. Like, I think let's make America great again. And he's not going to do all the things he says he's going to do. And then sure enough, you find out that he really is pushing on a lot of the things that he said he'd do. So I would say that Americans know Donald Trump better now than they did before. And I would say the polling numbers show that the independent voters, or the people who are in between the parties, are moving towards Joe Biden.
That's very interesting. I'm thinking it might be Donald Trump, because the last election I I wasn't sure, but then you just see what I think. There's probably a lot of closet supporters of Donald Trump.
Well, I'll bet you a 12-pack of Fort Garry Dark Ale there, Tracy.
Okay, you are on. Okay, so I'm going to put my last call out for questions. Anybody else has any more questions? While we're just waiting for that, Chris, is there any last final comments you wanted to share with the group on polling, or what the current global situation, what's going on?
Well, I would say there's a lot of information out there. I would say, some very good sources, CNN and especially CNN Interactive. I would say The Economist is a great source for a lot of these things. And then in Canada, I've been turning to the Globe and Mail quite a bit, as well as CBC. But the other outlets, CTV and Global, have some pretty good stuff. I would say the major pollsters release their stuff, and it's worth looking at some of theirs. So there's a lot of information out there. I've just sort of gathered it for this presentation. So thanks very much for having me at this presentation.
No, great. Thank you. I was actually I'm glad you mentioned that. So where can we get more information from? So thank you for sharing, some of those really good sources for us to get, an objective view of what's going on right now. So if there are no other questions, I want to thank you, Chris, for this very interesting and timely and engaging presentation, and to thank everybody on the line for participating today. We will be sending you a link to today's session, as well as a survey like we do every week, where you can share your thoughts and feedback. And we do encourage you to respond. It's really the only way that we're able to improve. We'll be sending you a more fulsome survey in a few weeks to gather your feedback on the overall Virtual Learning for Life program to help us planning for the fall. So I'm actually going to interrupt my final thoughts, because you've got another question that's come through, Chris. I'll throw that out. I don't want to let it go, and then I'll go back to what I was going to say. The question is, how trustworthy are polls? I have seen a lot of info on people being told to lie. That's interesting.
Yeah, so this is the bridge too far, is the question too far? But no, I'm happy to answer this. There are some people who misrepresent themselves, but most people who don't like polls, they'll just hang up, or they won't do them. I think you have to keep in mind that the companies that release their polls, like Nick Nanos is a highly reliable one, Ipsos is another one. Within Manitoba, PRA and Probe Research are pretty good pollsters, and Léger in Canada, and they have a Winnipeg operation. I would say there are a number of polling companies out there, but you have to keep in mind that the polling numbers they release to the media, that's a tiny fraction of their business. The business, most of their work is with like crown corporations, with private companies, financial companies, banks, and so on. So a polling company that puts out bad numbers in terms of what's the electorate thinking, a company doesn't want to do that. They're very, very worried about putting out numbers that will be incorrect, because when Great-West Life or the Royal Bank of Canada or Manitoba Lotteries is looking for a firm to do their marketing research, they want to hire a company that can accurately capture what customers are saying and what people are saying. So I would say the polls are pretty accurate, because they're a measure of the quality of a company, and a company that can't put quality numbers on politics isn't putting out quality numbers on what's your favorite candy bar, or what's your favorite bank, or what car would you be interested in buying.
Yeah, no, very good point. Thank you for that.
It's a good question, though.
Yeah, it is. It's a great question. Yes. Okay. So again, thank you everybody for participating in the Virtual Learning for Life series. Whether you participated one or in all 9, we appreciate your interest and consistent responses. Also to our weekly surveys, we do look at your feedback, and we are acting on that feedback. So many thanks for that. So besides today being the last day for the Spring Virtual Learning for Life program, it's also the last day for our President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. David Barnard, who has served the UM community with distinction for the last 12 years. An email has been sent to our entire global alumni community with the link to his end of term interview, and I encourage you to check it out. Many thanks to Dr. Barnard for all of his support over the years on alumni activity around the world, and we're excited to be welcoming incoming President and Vice Chancellor Dr. Michael Benarosh, who will start his role tomorrow. So Everybody, have a wonderful summer. Please stay safe, and we will be sharing information with you about the fall session very soon. Thank you very much.